in the autumn of 2014. I was 27 years old and had just relocated to a small village in rural Wales, roughly an hour and a half away from Cardiff. I was taking up a teaching post at a countryside primary school that had been advertising for teaching staff for months. I had completed my degree in education 2 years prior and spent that interval bouncing between substitute teaching in Manchester schools and living in a cramped apartment with 2 roommates who shared a rare trait. Neither of them had ever washed a dish in their lives. When I spotted the job advertisement, complete with pictures of breathtaking scenery, a fixed salary, and low living expenses, I accepted the offer without visiting the place first. That was my first mistake. The village wasn't a village in the truest sense. It had a single petrol station, a general store that opened at unpredictable hours, a post office you had to interact with as if it were a clandestine bureau, and fewer than 200 residents scattered across hills and valleys whose boundaries were only known to those who had lived there a long time. The school drew in children from 4 neighboring districts who arrived each morning in faded yellow buses that climbed up and down the rugged paths as if defying the laws of physics. I rented a house at the end of a dirt track about 3 kilometers from the village center. The house was old with all the charm of age. 2 bedrooms ending in a narrow corridor, a kitchen that wafted the scent of wood soaked in time, and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle, leaning toward the ground as if it had grown weary of standing for so long. The landlord was a man who lived in a more distant county. He gave me his phone number and said succinctly, "Call if something breaks, but otherwise you're fine." My closest neighbor lived in a modest house about 200 meters down the road. He told me his name was Liam, and I met him on the first day while I was unloading my boxes from the car. He emerged from a side trail walking calmly, hands shoved in his pockets, with a smile that seemed practiced beforehand. He was in his mid-30s, lean with a sort of quiet strength, his skin weathered by the sun and wind, and his eyes stared at you with an intensity that was slightly more than you would expect from a casual glance. He offered to help me carry the heavier boxes, and I accepted because I was exhausted and because refusing would have made things socially complicated. He spoke of the area with the familiarity of someone who lives there and sees nothing else. He told me which roads flooded during rains, where mobile signal dropped out, and that I should keep a landline as a backup. He mentioned that he worked in construction, odd shifts and fluctuating hours, and that if I ever needed anything, I shouldn't hesitate to ask. I thanked him, making sure to keep the distance between us strictly neighborly. I had learned early on that some people interpret warmth differently, and I wanted the boundaries to be crystal clear from the start. The first few weeks passed with a quietness that felt like convalescence after a long illness. I kept busy setting up my classroom, memorizing my students' names, and learning the geography of the village and its people. The isolation didn't bother me as much as I had anticipated. After the relentless noise of Manchester, this rural silence felt like absolute luxury. I would sit on the porch in the evenings with a cup of tea and a book, listening to the wind through the trees and the sound of birds that didn't stop in this area even after dusk. Liam stayed within his boundaries. I would see him from time to time, coming and going at irregular hours. His truck would sometimes arrive at midnight and leave before dawn. He would wave whenever he caught us outside at the same time, but he never tried to strike up conversations or linger. I was grateful for that. Then I began to notice things. Small things at first, easily chalked up to innocent explanations. Vehicles passing down our track at 2 or 3 in the morning. The headlights cutting across my bedroom wall and waking me. The sound of footsteps on the gravel, sometimes muffled. Urgent conversations followed by doors slamming shut with force. Once, I heard the voice of a woman speaking agitatedly, followed by a sudden silence that was far more unsettling than the voice itself. I told myself it was none of my business. People have their own complicated lives. Until that night in late September. It was around 11 in the evening, and I had gone to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water. The kitchen window looked out toward Liam's property, and as I stood by the sink, I spotted 2 figures in the driveway leading to his house. Liam and another man I had never seen before were both struggling to carry a heavy object between them. An automated floodlight mounted on the side of his house had triggered as they approached, and in that stark light, I saw what was in their hands with absolute clarity. At first, I thought it was a rolled-up carpet, the large, thick kind that requires two people to manage. But the way it slumped in the middle, that pliancy unique to objects possessing an internal, shifting weight, caused something in my gut to snap awake before my brain even fully registered it. They kept stopping every few paces to adjust their grip, speaking in clipped words I couldn't catch. Eventually, they heaved it together into the bed of a pickup truck I didn't recognize, quickly draped a thick tarp over it, and exchanged a few brief words before the stranger drove away alone. Liam headed back inside with uneasy strides. I stood by the sink for a long time. My heart was pounding at a speed that was entirely uncalled for if what I had witnessed was ordinary. I tried to rationalize the scene every way I could. Maybe he was throwing away an old rug. Maybe he was helping a friend move. Maybe I was blowing things out of proportion because crime dramas had warped my way of thinking. I convinced myself of this and went back to sleep, though it took quite some time. Weeks rolled by, and the matter had almost faded from my memory. Then, on a cold autumn afternoon, I pulled up at a shop in a nearby town to pick up a few necessities and spotted a piece of paper taped to the exterior glass. It was a missing persons flyer. Anna Ferguson, 23 years old, worked as a waitress at a diner on the main road. She was last spotted on a Friday night leaving work. The photograph showed a girl with dark hair and a reassured smile, the kind of face that makes you feel as though you already know her. I froze in front of the flyer for what felt like an endless moment. Then I returned to my car and sat inside without starting the engine. The carpet, the way it sagged, the haste with which they hid it. That night, I didn't sleep. I brought up every innocent explanation in my mind and tore it down. Over the following days, I noticed that Liam's visitors had increased. Different cars at bizarre hours, brief encounters in the driveway without entering the house. Something about the cadence of it all flew in the face of what I knew to be normal social visits. I didn't know what to do with this feeling. Call the police and say what? That my neighbor moved a carpet at night? Then, on an evening in mid-October, there was a knock at my back door. The back door that faced the woods behind the house. The door that absolutely no one ever knocked on, because no one ever approached from that direction. A single knock, then silence, followed by two heavier raps. I stood dead center in the room, my pen hovering over a marking sheet, entirely motionless. Then I rose slowly toward the door. Through the small window pane, I saw him, Liam. He was standing on the concrete slab of the back porch. His face held nothing of the smile from the day I moved in. It was rigid in a way that made his features look less like an expression and more like a grim decision. I opened the door, but kept the security screen door locked between us. He stared at me heavily and began in a calm that was deeply unnerving. He said he had noticed me watching his property, that he had seen me looking out the window at night, and that he knew I had seen what happened that night with the carpet. He said he wanted us to have an understanding. I felt my mouth go dry. I tried to keep my voice even and told him I had no idea what he was talking about, that I lived my own life and didn't care what my neighbors did. He shook his head slowly and said he hoped that was true, because things would be much simpler for everyone if I just forgot what I saw. He said the situation was complicated, that there were elements to it I couldn't possibly comprehend, and that making phone calls or asking questions would be a very bad idea. He never raised his voice. He never uttered an explicit threat, but every word carried a weight that knew exactly how to land in the right spot. Then he said in a tone that sounded entirely pleasant, "Have a good evening." He turned and walked back toward his property with slow, unhurried steps, like a man who knows there is absolutely no need to rush. I shut the door. I locked the screen. I turned both keys. I pulled the curtains over every single window in the house. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand until dawn. Every hour, I weighed the two arguments. The first, call the police right now. The second, you are entirely alone at the end of a dirt track. If you call and they come and question him and then leave, you are still left here with him and a mere 200-meter gap between you. What would stop him then? But every time I wavered, Anna Ferguson's face would rush back into my mind, that smile on the missing flyer, and something inside me would harden. In the morning, I drove to school like a sleepwalker with my eyes open. I taught my classes while hearing myself speak from a distance. During the lunch break, I went out to the car park, dialed the non-emergency police number, and told them everything. The carpet, the night, the missing woman, and the words he had spoken at my back door. 2 days later, a detective constable came to my house. He sat in the kitchen while I recounted everything in detail. He noted it down in his booklet and told me they would look into it, advising me to keep my doors locked and to call immediately if Liam approached me again or if I noticed anything unusual. Over the following week, I noticed police cars occasionally passing down our road, stopping for a few minutes before moving on. I felt safe and terrified all at once because I knew Liam saw what I saw and that he was capable of doing the math. Then, on a Wednesday morning, I woke up to the sound of idling engines and people walking outside. From my bedroom window, I saw 3 police cruisers and an unmarked white van parked in front of Liam's house. Officers in tactical gear were deployed across the property, some stationed at the doors, others entering and exiting carrying boxes and tagged bags. Yellow tape was being strung across the land. That evening, the detective returned to my house. He informed me that they had executed a search warrant based on my report and other pieces of intelligence they had been gathering. On the property, they uncovered evidence linking Liam and others to a human trafficking ring operating across 3 regions in South Wales and Western England. The house was being used as a safe house where victims were held for short periods before being moved. They discovered documentation, restraints, and items that tied Liam and his associates to multiple victims, including Anna Ferguson, whose remains had been discovered in a woodland 35 kilometers away. The detective told me that my report had been pivotal in launching the investigation. I didn't feel anything resembling heroism. I felt sick, weighed down by a bizarre guilt. The guilt of hesitation. The guilt of the nights that had elapsed between seeing that carpet and making the call. Liam was arrested along with 4 others. The case went to court, and I testified to what I had seen that night and what had taken place at my back door. I sat in the courtroom and looked at Liam across the dividing space. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison, and his accomplices received similar sentences. The prosecutor told me later that the evidence recovered from the property allowed them to identify other victims who might never have been found otherwise. I moved out of the house a week after the trial concluded. I simply couldn't stay on that dirt track, knowing what had been happening just 200 meters away from me all those months. I moved back to a major city and took a job at school in a bustling suburb where neighbors know one another and the police station is minutes away. I am 37 now. I teach mathematics at a secondary school, and my life is quiet in the best sense of the word. The kind of quiet where you know its source and can trust it. But I still think about that night, about the 2 men beneath the floodlight and the weight that hung between them. I think about what could have happened had I let fear win, had I convinced myself that it wasn't my business and that intervening carried too high a personal cost. But most of all, I think about Anna Ferguson, the girl with the reassured smile on a piece of paper taped to the glass of a cold shopfront. And I wonder if I had called that very same night, the night I saw the carpet instead of weeks later, would anything have changed about how it ended? That question never truly leaves. It sits quietly in the corner of my memory, demanding nothing more than to be remembered from time to time. A stark reminder of what seconds of decision mean when they are weighed on the true scales. In the autumn of 2019, I was 26 years old, living alone in a coastal city where I knew no one, in an old house where no one knew me. Slowly, I was beginning to lose my ability to distinguish between what was real and what our brains conjure up when they have lived in fear for too long. To this day, I cannot fully explain what happened to me in that house. And this inability to explain is the most painful part of the entire story. My name is Ethan Collier. Before that, I lived in Manchester, where I was born and raised. However, when I was offered a job as a data analyst at a medium-sized shipping company based in Portsmouth, I accepted without much thought. I wanted change. I wanted to prove to myself, before anyone else, that I was capable of starting over in a place where no one knew me. What I failed to consider carefully was that Manchester was not just a city. It was an entire safety net. My therapist, whom I had known for years, friends who knew when to call me when they sensed something wasn't right, and familiar places that reminded me that the world was real and I was part of it. I left all of that behind and headed south. I arrived in Portsmouth in January. The house I rented was in the Old Haven district, just a few minutes' walk from the beach, built of dark stones that had absorbed the sea's moisture for decades. It was a two-story house, constructed at the turn of the last century according to the landlady, and it possessed all those details that make old houses feel alive. A wooden staircase that groaned underfoot, windows that buzzed when the cold sea wind blew, pipes that made noises in the middle of the night as if they were breathing, and high ceilings that made voices echo in a way modern houses do not. The upper floor contained two large rooms. I only used one as a bedroom and left the other empty, as I didn't need it. Above the upper floor was a spacious attic reached by a small door in one of the walls. I opened that door once when I moved in, turned on the flashlight, and saw what you usually see in such places. Wooden beams, dilapidated cardboard boxes left by some previous resident, and a thick layer of dust over everything. I closed the door and forgot about it. Under normal circumstances, I would have loved that house, but circumstances were not normal. The first problem was the loneliness, not in the sense that I wished I had friends, but in a deeper, more painful sense. That kind of loneliness that makes you gradually forget what your facial features look like when you are relaxed. I had no acquaintances in the city. My colleagues disappeared behind their screens the moment office hours ended, and my attempts to build new social relationships stumbled every time for reasons I cannot precisely identify. Perhaps it was the city, or perhaps it was me. The landlady was a woman in her mid-60s named Margaret Fuller. She lived 2 streets away, called me every 2 weeks to check in, and asked if anything needed repair. Those calls were sometimes the only human contact I had in an entire day, and that fact alone was enough to tell me how bad my condition was. I have always been someone who suffers from anxiety, but over the years, I learned how to deal with it. Medication, regular sessions with a therapist who knew me and my history, going out with friends who knew when to leave me be in certain situations, walking in familiar places. When I moved to Portsmouth, I was referred to a therapist I didn't know working in a clinic 24 minutes away by bus. He was professional and articulate, but the sessions were cold, as if we were filling out an administrative form together rather than talking. And when the GP readjusted my medication twice in 2 months, I didn't feel much difference either time. My sleep began to unravel. It didn't happen all at once, but gradually, as important things usually unravel without you noticing until the damage is done. I started staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning working or staring at the screen, then waking up near noon with a heavy head and swollen eyes. The house in those late hours looked completely different than it did during the day. More cramped despite its spaciousness. The shadows were deeper than they should be, and the noises made by its walls and pipes seemed to carry meaning at night. I told myself this was normal in a house over 100 years old. I was trying to believe myself. Then I started hearing the footsteps. At first, I thought I was dreaming, or I thought the sound came from the street, from a neighbor awake late, from something outside. But after the 3rd night, I realized the sound was coming specifically from inside the house, from the upper floor, from the empty room I didn't use. Slow, measured footsteps, like the steps of someone walking with deliberate care from one end of the room to the other and back. They were not random or intermittent as old house noises usually are. They had a clear, intentional rhythm. 16 steps in one direction, a short pause, then 16 steps in the opposite direction. That is the number of steps if you measured the length of the upper room. you would find it matched exactly. I went up on the first night when I heard them. I opened the room door and turned on the main light. Empty. The dust that had accumulated on its floor was untouched, or so it seemed to me in that light. I closed the door and went back to my bed, heart pounding wildly. 20 minutes later, the footsteps began again. I grabbed a small notebook that was on my table and decided to log every time I heard the sound. I wrote down the time, duration, and nature of the sound. After a full week, I looked at what I had written and found what I didn't want to find. The footsteps started at 2:56 a.m. every night, without a single exception. This consistency was disturbing in a way I cannot describe. Houses, when they groan and expand, do not stick to fixed schedules. Pipes do not know the hour. But what does know the hour? I searched the house again, this time more thoroughly. I opened every cupboard, looked behind every door, went up to the upper room, and checked every corner. I went to the attic door, opened it, and stuck my head inside. Thick dust, huge wooden beams forming intersecting shadows. I saw nothing. No one was there. I was alone in the house, me and my imagination and footsteps that would not stop. When things started to move, I thought my mind was collapsing. It was small details at first. My left shoe in a place I don't remember leaving it. The house keys hanging on the wrong hook. A book I remember leaving face down on the page where I stopped. I find closed on the table. I told myself that stress and sleep fog do strange things to memory, which the doctor confirmed when I called him. Chronic stress clearly affects short-term memory, he said in a calm, reassuring voice as he raised the medication dosage for a third time. But the medication did not make the footsteps stop. 2:56 a.m. became a time that filled me with dread minutes before it arrived. I would sit in bed, staring at the clock, waiting, and when the sound began, I would count the steps reflexively, unable to stop myself. 16 going, pause, 16 coming. This continued for about 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed the stopping was somehow more exhausting than the sound itself. I decided one night to confront the matter head-on. I had read about anxiety confrontation techniques, about the importance of facing sources of fear instead of avoiding them. I told myself that when I went up and saw the room empty at the moment the footsteps were at their loudest, maybe that would finally convince my brain that nothing was there. The footsteps began at the usual time. I waited 2 or 3 minutes until I was certain their rhythm had settled, then stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and went up the stairs. My hands were shaking. I reached the room door, turned the handle, and opened it. The footsteps stopped at the exact moment I opened the door. I turned on the flashlight and swept its beam around the room. Empty. The dust accumulated on the floor was untouched. There was nothing. I went down, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed trying to breathe normally. Exactly 12 minutes later, the footsteps began again. This time, I couldn't control myself. I screamed at the top of my lungs for them to stop, to leave me alone, that whatever was there had to stop this madness. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was unnaturally oppressive. Then, with measured slowness, the footsteps began again. But this time, they were not going back and forth above my head. They were approaching the door. I heard the upper room door open. I heard footsteps on the wooden stairs, step after step, slow and distinct. They reached the hallway in front of my bedroom and stopped. Then I heard the sound I never expected to hear, breathing. Slow, deep, regular, coming from behind the closed door. I pulled the duvet over my head like a small child, my heart pounding violently, nearly in pain. I remained like that, frozen, not moving, holding my breath. The breathing continued. It was undoubtedly a human sound, not pipes, nor wind, nor delusions. Then it stopped. I heard the footsteps return slowly towards the stairs and go up. I heard the upper room door close softly. I called the police immediately. I could barely speak, trying to explain what had happened while knowing full well how what I was saying sounded. The dispatcher said in a calm, professional voice that she would stay on the line with me until the officers arrived. Two of them arrived after 8 minutes. They searched the house completely. First floor, second floor, attic, and back garden. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no open doors. One of the officers suggested that the noises of old houses can be very misleading, and that rodents sometimes make sounds that seem to the exhausted human ear like the sounds of footsteps. He said it kindly and with a reasonable amount of empathy, but he said it. After they left, I sat in the living room with all the lights on until morning dawned. I did not sleep. The next day, I called Margaret Fuller to tell her what had happened. She told me that the house had remained vacant for nearly 3 years before I rented it, and that the previous tenant left before his contract ended and didn't give her a clear reason. She paused for a second, then said he requested her urgently to change the front door lock shortly before his departure, and she hadn't thought much of it at the time. I didn't know how to interpret what she told me, so I added that piece of information to the pile of things I didn't understand. In the following days, I practically stopped sleeping. I sat in the living room, working or staring at the screen, avoiding the upper floor entirely, avoiding the hallway. I came to live in a space not exceeding 2 rooms in a large house. I lost more than 3 kilograms in 2 weeks because I forgot to eat or didn't want to. My parents called, and when they heard my voice, they insisted on coming to visit. But I convinced them I was fine because I wasn't ready to explain what was happening to people I loved. The footsteps continued, and sometimes they began to happen at noon too, when the sun was at its highest and the house was fully lit. I would be sitting at my table and hear them from above, those slow, measured footsteps, as if someone walking above my head did not care about my knowledge of their presence. Then, on an ordinary Thursday morning, I found what changed everything. I was looking for a shirt in the wardrobe when I noticed that one of the drawers was pushed back slightly in an unusual way. I pulled it out, and behind it, hidden between the back wall of the wardrobe and part of the floor, was a small hole leading to a void between the walls. When I shone my flashlight and put my hand in, I found what I never expected to find there in my life. Empty food wrappers, empty plastic water bottles, a folded blanket, and a manila envelope full of photos. Small printed photos of a person sitting at the kitchen table, working on his computer, of a person sleeping on the living room sofa, of a person standing in front of the open fridge. That person was me. I ran out of the house in my pajamas and called the police from the pavement. This time when they came, they were more in number and more serious. They found the entry point. A wooden plank in the side wall of the house, close to the back garden, had been carefully removed and put back, so it didn't look broken. They found in the attic, in the void between 2 rows of large wooden beams, a small, intentionally organized space. Some human had pulled the beams far enough away to create a place where one could sleep. They found more photos there, and a notebook containing pages written in tiny, precise handwriting describing my daily routine in details that make the stomach turn. They set an ambush and waited. After hours, around sunset, the officer saw a ghost moving along the side wall towards the entry point. They stopped him immediately. He was a man in his mid-30s, tall, thin, with eyes empty and calm in a way more disturbing than any agitation. The police later told me his name was Richard Blaine, and that he had a documented record in 3 British cities, Norwich, Leicester, and Bristol, involving sneaking into houses where single people live and living in the hidden spaces thereof, in attics, basements, and voids between walls, observing the lives of their owners from cracks and gaps. He never physically harmed anyone at any time. He just watched. He lived in the shadows and watched. He was convicted of trespass, stalking, and private life spying offenses, and was sentenced to 2 years and 9 months in prison. When I read the sentence, I couldn't help but think that he would get out one day. I left the house the same day. I threw what I could carry into 2 bags and went to a hotel, and I never returned. Margaret Fuller terminated the contract without objection and returned the full deposit. My parents came from Manchester and helped move the rest of my belongings with a removal company, because I couldn't enter that house again. even when I stood on the pavement in front of it one last time, pointing out to the workers what to carry. I couldn't approach the door. I spent an entire year in therapy after that, with a new therapist I finally found in Manchester when I moved back to live with my parents. She was helping me understand something deeply unsettling, that my anxiety was not deluded, that something inside me knew throughout those months that there was something wrong, even while I was trying to convince myself otherwise, and even while I was convincing the doctors that I was just tired. My body was sending correct signals, but the trap I fell into was that everyone around me and I myself interpreted those correct signals as illness and not danger. But knowing that did not make me feel safer. On the contrary, it made me trust myself less, because I never knew where anxiety intuitions ended and reality began. Which of the things I imagined were real? Were my belongings moving actually? Was the breathing I heard behind the door real? Did Richard Blaine enter my bedroom at some point while I was asleep? The police couldn't answer. Richard Blaine refused to answer any question. The nightmares still come regularly. I wake up breathing fast, sit in bed, and stare at the dark corners of the room. Go up and check doors and windows before my heart eases. I cannot enter an old house without asking about its attic and insisting on seeing it. I cannot hear house noises at night without a panic igniting that doesn't subside easily. My friends to whom I told the story sometimes say with good intention that enough time has passed, that I need to get over it. They don't understand that what happened was not an incident, but a transformation. That something in the way I view the world changed forever. Sometimes I think about Richard Blaine and wonder where he is now. Did he complete a sentence? Did he get out? Is he doing the same thing somewhere else with someone else who is now trying to convince themselves that the noises they hear above their head are just an old house breathing? The line between imaginary fear and real fear is much thinner than we want to believe. And in a world where we are constantly taught to silence our inner anxiety and describe it as exaggeration, the price we pay sometimes might be bigger than we imagine. The most terrifying monsters are not those that inhabit imagination. They are those that know how to live in places we never think to check. Those that learn your routine, your schedule, and the way you breathe while you are asleep, and remain invisible until the moment they choose to stop hiding. What haunts me today is not Blaine's memory, but one question I cannot answer. In how many other houses, in how many other cities, is there a person sitting now in the dark, hearing noises and convincing themselves that they are just tired?